So for our next speaker, we have Holly Donohue, who is the fractional CPO and product coach at Product Rebel. With nearly 20 years in tech, Holly excels in product strategy and team empowerment. In her spare time, Holly runs Product Tank Manchester, a community of over 2,000 product people, as her way of giving back to the product community.
Hello, thank you all for coming. So what's the hardest thing about moving towards a product-led way of working? Anybody want to shout out? Well, in my experience, it's people. People are often the hardest thing about changing our ways of working. I'm Holly, I'm a fractional CPO and product coach, and I've spent the last 10 years of my career grappling with moving organisations towards a product-led way of working. You might call it value-led, value-focused, outcome-led. But essentially, all the things Stuart was talking about in his talk this morning, if you saw that. So using discovery to understand the customer problems, understand the customer needs, figuring out and using evidence, what the most valuable thing is that we could possibly do right now, and then empowering a team of skilled individuals to come up with the best solution to that need, to meet that need. So whilst I've been doing this, I've started to notice some patterns. And these are things that are patterns within myself, but also patterns within many of the people that I've worked with. As digital professionals, whether you're a product manager, scrum master, UXer, engineer, QA, it seems really obvious to us, right? It seems really obvious as to why we would want to work in this way. Yet to our stakeholders, it doesn't seem so obvious, and so we find it really hard to empathise with them, and we start to commit the 7 deadly mistakes of change, which I'm going to start talking through. So, going back to the start, once upon a time, I was a young product manager. Well, I wasn't that young because I career switched into product management from a more operational career. And I was the only product manager within my part of the organisation, so I didn't have anybody to learn from. So I turned to all of the books, all of the blogs. I would have listened to the podcasts, but they weren't such a big thing back then. That's how long I've been doing this. And I started to imagine this world where we would do all the research, run the experiments, where we'd discover all these opportunities that nobody had thought of before, then we'd come up with the best solution to that, and our customers would love us, they'd love our products, all our stakeholders would cheer, it would be fantastic. Hands up, who's been that person at some point in their career? It's okay to admit it, it's a safe space. Yep. Okay. Hands up if you currently work in that organisation now, if you currently work in a very product operating model, product-led way of working. A few hands, but not many hands. And in fact, now is probably the first time I can put my hand up because one of the clients that I'm working with currently is working in that way. So it does exist, but for most of us, we're going to find ourselves in a situation where we're perhaps not working in that way. We come across this expectation gap. I often find there's a really big expectation gap between how we think things should be working and the reality of how things do work. And then there's another gap between how we think things should be working and how our stakeholders think things should be working. Okay, the expectation gap. And often we find ourselves in a situation where we are given a shopping list of features to build. They all have to be delivered by a certain deadline. There's no reasoning behind that deadline, it's just a deadline. And our success is measured by how well we meet that deadline, by how many features we churn out within a certain period of time. What's that called? Feature factory, exactly. So often we're in the feature factory. And when we're in that situation, presumably we're in a place, and I'm assuming that we want to move towards a more product operating model. I actually like to call it an outcome-led way of working because it makes it less about product team ruling the world and more about what we're actually trying to achieve in terms of focusing on the outcomes to be delivered. So we find ourselves in this position of change leadership, change management. And the thing is, we've trained as product people, as UXers, as developers. We've not necessarily changed, unless maybe if you're an Agile coach, this might be the only exception. We've not necessarily trained as change leaders. And I certainly hadn't. And so in the process of doing this, I have made some bad decisions. I have taken some bad actions, had some bad behaviours, but I've learned from those. And I'm going to share some of those mistakes that I've made, not just because it's kind of like a mass group therapy session, and we all need a bit of that sometimes, but also so that you can start to shortcut some of those learnings, so that you don't have to go through all of the pain that I've been through. Oh, why is that not working? Okay, great. I was recently working with an organisation, and product management as a whole was a very new concept to them. So they'd had a product team for about 6 months, and a lot of what I was doing was introducing, so I came in as a product leader, I was introducing product management practices, and to be honest, quite a lot of agile practices as well. So I was doing things like coaching the team on having product refinement sessions, on having a backlog, on having a roadmap, introducing all of these artifacts. The product team and the UX team were not speaking to the customers whatsoever in a user learning capacity, whether that's user research, user testing. Discovery wasn't a word within the vocabulary of the organisation, so this was all very new concepts. Now, as you might imagine, in an organisation where that maturity in that way of working is quite low, one day the CEO came to me and he said, I have got this brilliant idea. I 100% guarantee that this idea is going to make us loads of money. Now, I wish I had his confidence, and this is why I'm not CEO, and full respect to people who can do that, that's not me. But immediately my product management sensors were starting to prickle, and see a few people kind of bristling in the room. We've all been there. So often we get these pet project ideas, somebody's spoken to one customer, and now it's the most important thing that we need to do. And so often it's not being validated. It probably does offer value for a few customers, but not in comparison to a lot of the other things that we've got on the roadmap. It's always that it doesn't offer no value. That's a really important distinction, but it offers low value. And I was always taught, or I learned from all the books, that in order to combat these ideas, then what we need to do, anybody want to shout out what we taught as product people to do with these pet projects? Any thoughts? Do discovery, use data, use evidence to prove that this idea, validate that this idea isn't the right thing to do. Now, so what I did was I went to my CEO and said, okay, let's run a discovery on that. How do you think my CEO reacted to that? Not well, not well. So what my CEO wanted was for me to go, yes, that's amazing. I need to hang up right now because I need to call the team and get them working on that immediately. And what he heard in my let's run a discovery on that response was me kind of saying, okay, let me find a way to prove you wrong. And, our CEOs aren't stupid, that, they know that this is what you're doing if that's your intent behind it. And the thing is, as product leaders and product managers, we have to be a bit careful that we're not falling foul to our own biases, that we're not kind of having that not invented here syndrome, because sometimes just because an idea hasn't followed our processes doesn't mean that it's not going to be a good idea, that there's not value in it. So we do have to be mindful of that. But in this case, I knew that we'd already released part of this idea before. We hadn't got any traction with customers. Yes, it needed a lot of work, but actually it was at a point that we could have sales conversations about it, and nobody was biting. So we had reasonable evidence to suggest that this perhaps wasn't the right way to go. It was a departure from our strategy. It wasn't targeting the product set or the areas that we were going for at the time. And the thing is, the CEO had a really emotional connection to this idea. He'd spoken to a customer, so that was giving him lots of social proof as to why this idea was the right way to go. And the problem is you can't really logic through that emotion, so we have to find another way to approach this set, because just providing evidence and data, it's not going to work to shift that emotional connection. Now, I've made this mistake many times, and it even got to a point where I knew that this was a mistake, but I didn't have any alternative way to deal with this situation, because all the books said, use discovery, use evidence, but nobody said there might be another way to approach this that perhaps isn't exactly how it says in the textbooks. So even though I was making this mistake and knew it, I just didn't have another way of doing it. And the problem with that is, especially for a point where we're trying to introduce discovery practices, or where this is coming a lot and discovery is being used a lot to kind of disprove stakeholder ideas, our stakeholders are going to start associating discovery as a bad thing. They're going to start thinking of discovery as a negative thing. And that's not what we want. We want people to see the benefit of discovery. So we want discovery to be an additive process, to identify new opportunities, to add value to existing ideas. So a way of tackling this situation is, one way of doing this might be to try and buy yourself some time. So it does look a little bit, and being very open here, like, look at this shiny object over here. Why don't you, this shiny thing over here, it's going to deliver more value. Let's focus all our attention and efforts on that, because we've said that this is really high and valuable. And what that does is it buys you a little bit of time. And it might be that the time now isn't the right time to have the conversation about why this idea might not be the right thing right now. But in a couple of months' time, that emotional attachment might have reduced, and you might be able to have, and there might be other priorities coming up, you might be able to have a more productive conversation around it. So don't underestimate the value of timing with these conversations. Really think about, is this the right time to be having this conversation? It's going to be a long time to learn that. And sometimes we have to say yes to the wrong thing for the right reasons. And this definitely is not in the textbooks. But sometimes we have to build the feature, which we know is only going to deliver low value. We make the best of it, so we try and make it add as much value as it possibly can. And we also maximize the work not done, using those lean and agile principles, maximize the work that we don't do on it, so that we can move on to the next thing that is going to be more valuable. And the reason why we might want to do that is it builds up trust. It builds up trust and relationship with our stakeholders. And that trust is going to mean that in the future, we have more opportunity to influence and change how things work. Now, you'll notice that this is definitely not the perfect way that it will say in the books, or any of the kind of thought leadership about how to be a product leader. But if you're not working in the perfect organisation, with the perfect stakeholders, in the perfect system, then your process isn't going to look perfect yet either. So it's all about thinking about, what can we do today that was better than yesterday? What's going to enable us to do something better tomorrow? Progress over perfection. So coming back to my story, so we did build some of those wrong things, but we also built some right things as well. And we built up positive relationships with our stakeholders, and over time, that enabled us to propose an OKR. It enabled us to propose an outcome for us to work to. And what it meant is that we could run a discovery process. So this was a discovery process that we ran. We started to do some funnel analysis of the website, started to do analysis on the scroll depths. The outcome was to increase conversion on the website. We proposed some hypotheses. We figured out which of those hypotheses we thought were going to offer the most value. We ran some tests on those, and we got to a result of increasing our conversion by 11%. And what that did was it gave us the opportunity to propose another outcome. Now, alongside that, we still had 3 other teams who were still working in that feature factory. So we were still doing feature development alongside this, but what we were doing was we just opened up an opportunity for us to showcase a different way of working, to showcase the benefits of doing that. And over time, that meant that we could start to increase how many outcomes we were working towards. And over time, it ended up with just one team working on features. So that was probably over about 2.5 years that this took. So it's not something that happens overnight. It's something that takes time. And we formalised the process. So we started to draw it out. So this is one way of showing that product development life cycle. So ideas come in. We do the double diamond of discovery, of ideation and solutioning. We had a prioritised queue for work to wait for the delivery team to pull from it. We had sprint prep in there because, this was an immature organisation, so we were still training the teams to prepare before they took stuff into sprint, to do some backlog refinement, to do some spikes. And then we had in sprint release readiness and measure at the end. That's always really important. But when we started drawing it out, and the timing of this wasn't great, we hit another snag. So during this time, for various reasons, our CEO started getting much more involved in the business again. And he started to reminisce back to the days of scrappy startup time, where an idea would go from in his head directly to in sprint, nothing in between. So when he started to see this process drawn out, all of a sudden, what's all this stuff getting in the way of my ideas? I know what the right thing is to build, you just need to build it. So we had to think about how could we start to show our CEO the value of this. And of course, the value of this is understanding, maximising the value that we deliver to our customers, but also avoiding some of those near misses or avoiding some of those things that maybe actually aren't as valuable as we thought. But to him, it just felt like we were getting in the way. We felt really, really slow. And what was actually happening was that our delivery teams, they were full. They were already working on other stuff. So even if we didn't do discovery work, they would not be ready to pick up more work. So actually, we weren't slowing down the process, but to our CEO, it felt like we were. And perception is everything. Perception is so important. It doesn't matter what's actually happening. What matters is what your stakeholders think is happening. So you do not want to be in a place where your team is seen as a blocker. You want to be seen as an enabler. So we realised that we needed to quickly change this situation. And to do this, we changed how we communicated. We realised that as a product team, as UXers, we really over-indexed on how much we spoke about discovery. Discovery work is really interesting to us. We learn so much from it. We see the value in it. Let's face it, it's quite fun. So we want to talk about it a lot. But our exec stakeholders don't really care, as bad as it sounds, but they're not interested in the detail of the process. What they're interested in is results. They're interested in delivery. So we changed our communication to focus on delivery. We were still doing that discovery, sometimes in stealth, but it's not that we weren't hiding it. And, I think we always want to bring our stakeholders on this journey, but sometimes we have to realise that that's not where our stakeholders are, and actually it's more productive to show them the discovery when it's done, rather than bring them along the process. It fits more into their models and ways of working, and sometimes we have to meet our stakeholders where they are. Let me get a drink. Okay. So we've spoken about not using discovery to prove your CEO wrong. In fact, just generally try not to prove your CEO wrong. Generally not a good idea. And we've spoken about not letting the product team or your delivery teams become a blocker. And a lot of what we're talking about, it's all about stakeholder relationships. And I was working in another organisation, and everything wasn't really peachy. So we've got a digital team, a product team, that had kind of been plonked in a PMO model. So the team had product manager, delivery manager, project manager, a program manager, obviously head of product, and also a technical delivery manager who'd come from somewhere else completely in the organisation. This is a massive organisation. And all of a sudden, we had more people trying to manage this team than there were people in the team. And this was really frustrating for everybody involved. So from the team's perspective, they felt that there was so much stakeholder communication overhead, they couldn't get anything done, they had to do all this reporting stuff that wasn't very agile. But it was two ways, because for our PMO function, we were like a black hole. they couldn't get the information out of us that they needed to report to their stakeholders and to fit in with their processes. So there was real friction on both sides. And it turned out that there were some reports that were going from the PMO office about the work of our team to our exec team. And one day I didn't know about this, and one day somebody sent me this report and said, "Have you seen this?" And, I couldn't help but notice that the digital team have failed to deliver yet again was on there. So this was now forming into the narrative around our digital team. I mean, this wasn't just passive-aggressive, it was full-on aggressive. This is full-on, you are not working well. I mean, the reality was that, and the thing is, always look within you. There was definitely things that we could be doing better, but it was a misalignment problem. We weren't aligning on the expectations, on the dates, and there was just miscommunication all around. So I did various things to start to address this. And one of the things was I asked the program leader, let's call Sophie, I asked Sophie, could you send me those reports before they go, please? I kind of want to see them before they go. And I got to the point where she sent me them after they went, so at least I got to see what was in them. But I couldn't get to see them before. It wasn't until my principal delivery manager had this idea and he said, let's take a different approach to this. So what he suggested was that we spent 2 hours, put 2 hours in the diary, just me, him and Sophie, and we asked Sophie to explain her whole world to us. So we asked her to explain, what's the process that you have to go through? Where do we fit into this? What do you need from us at different points and why? So we asked her, how can we help effectively? How can we understand what you have to do and how can we help you do that? And overnight, and it was an overnight change, that relationship just flipped, it just completely changed. And all of a sudden, she became our biggest advocate. And she was advocating for us with the exec team, with stakeholders that we couldn't access at a time when it was quite difficult to advocate for our team. We were seen as negative, so she was a huge help for us in shifting how our team was perceived. And this was a really big learning from me, and it actually pulls a lot from sales thinking in terms of think about what you can do for somebody first before you ask them to do something for you. So for Sophie, I was asking her to change her process for me. I was asking her to change. So now, instead of just sending the reports, she had to come to me. That's going to add a delay in there. The reports might get out late. I might request changes that are difficult, that don't fit in with her narrative. So I was asking her to do something that's hard for her, and I wasn't giving her anything in return. So I like to think of our relationships with stakeholders and our team as a bank balance now. But it is a debit account, it's not a credit account. So you need to deposit credit into there before you can withdraw it out. And this really is a balance, because sometimes by depositing into your stakeholder bank balance, you're going to be withdrawing from a team bank balance. So it might be that you need to deliver something for a stakeholder, hopefully minimizing how long it takes, which your team don't believe in, which they don't think is the right thing to do. And you might not think it's the right thing to do, but you might think it's important for the relationship. And that's probably going to piss your team off a little bit. So in order for them to do that, you need to have paid into your team bank balance first, invested in them, so that you're still in credit in that relationship. So just taking a step back, we've spoken about not using discovery to prove your CEO wrong, not being a blocker, managing your stakeholder bank balance, and now we're going to talk about introducing change incrementally and iteratively. Kind of sounds familiar, right? Concept we might have come across before. So I think the thing about introducing change is, I said at the start, we're not trained as change managers, but actually, so many of the tools that we have in our pockets as digital people are really useful for introducing change, and we can use them in these scenarios. And one of those tools which is really useful is empathy mapping. Now, you've probably used empathy mapping at some point to understand your users, understand what are your users hearing, seeing, saying, feeling. You can use this for your stakeholders as well. So you can start to map out, what are your stakeholders hearing about our team? What are they doing with our team? What are they saying about our team? And you can start to understand where they're coming from. And it gets even more powerful when you start to think, well, what pain does our way of working cause our stakeholders? What are the opportunities in our ways of working for our stakeholders? And what do they value? What do they care about? And that's really important because often they're going to care about things that maybe are a bit different to what we care about. So we need to think about that when we're communicating with them, that we're talking in terms of things that they care about, not in terms of things that we care about. So this was an exercise we did with a few of our key stakeholders, and one of the pieces we did on there was actually who influences these stakeholders as well. So thinking about if we can't, especially if you're in a large organisation, if we can't directly influence these stakeholders, who can? How can we make sure that other people are advocating for us as well? Building up that social proof. Because the thing is, when you start to look at what a transformation involves, there's quite a lot often to do. Now, this is a tube map. It's quite a handy way of mapping out all the changes that need to happen. This was actually from an interview process that I was doing, but I've done this before with various organisations to look at how do we step-by-step implement change. And when you start to look at things like this, you realise it's actually quite a big shift from where we are. And for both team members and stakeholders, potentially what's happening is we're going to push people out of their comfort zone. We're going to push people into new ways of working. If you know one of those kind of principles in terms of what people value at work, mastery is one of the things that people need to feel fulfilled at work. We want to feel good. We want to feel that we are doing a good job, that we know what we're doing. And by introducing new ways of working, we're pushing people to be a beginner again. They've got to learn how to work again, and that's really quite scary for many people. It's quite uncomfortable for many people, so we want to do that gently, because if you push too hard, people are going to push back hard. So we want to make it achievable, those little small incremental steps. So make sure that we're introducing change incrementally and iteratively. Think about what's the next smallest thing we can do that's better. And over days of doing the next smallest thing that's better, weeks, months, you end up with a big shift. But you do it in a way that brings people with you. And a really good place to start, by the way, I found, is start at the end. Reverse engineer this. So think about the features that you're delivering. You can calculate how much those features cost. So if you have access to people's costs, great. If not, you absolutely can ask your leader, how much does our team cost? What's an approximate cost for our team per sprint? And you can use that to start to put some rough estimates on how much it costs to deliver each feature. And then you can start to think of, well, what benefits did this feature deliver? What value did it deliver? And what this is doing is it's starting to train everybody, you, the teams, our stakeholders, in this vocabulary of value, and actually starting to go back and measure it. And over time, you start to push that further up the process. You start to push it earlier on in the process. So you start at the end, but then partway through, maybe you start to think about, well, what does success look like for this feature? And eventually, you start off with, what success are we trying to get to? Okay, well, how are we actually going to run a discovery process to figure out how we're going to deliver that? So start backwards, and that's okay. So I think as Agile product professionals, we often get stuck in there being a right way of doing things. I am very guilty of this. I've done this a lot. I've had to learn, and it's taken me a long time to learn not to get so wrapped up in what the right way of doing something is. We often focus so much on the process, and actually what we need to focus on is the results, because the results are really what matters. The process is really fun and tangible to talk about, but the hard thing actually is the results. And what we know again from our discovery phase is there's often multiple ways to get to those results. So it doesn't matter which way you take as long as you get to the right result. And I wanted to mention this because so often we come to these conferences, read the books, something to think about over the next couple of days, and we get really inspired about our ways of working and how things could be. And then we get back to work and it doesn't quite look quite how it did at the conference. It feels a very, very long way away from what we've heard at the conference. So, think about, and that's okay, it's great to be inspired. And it's really important to be inspired because we know the art of the possible then. But the next step is just thinking about, and what would be great to think about over these next couple of days, what's the incremental step that will take me to where I want to get to? What one thing, small thing, can I do tomorrow when I get back to work, or next week when I get back to work? It doesn't have to look exactly how it's been described, just what's one small thing that will make it a little bit better. So don't drown in the dogma. Don't be that evangelist. That's not agile, that's not product. Don't be that person. I've definitely been there. I think what I notice with a lot of the people that I coach with, consult with, misery really lives in that should be. It's where we're in that kind of should be. It should work like this. It should be like this. That's what makes us really miserable. Think about how could it be? How can it be today? How can we make it a little bit better tomorrow? And that's where hope lives. That's where we make improvements. And that's where we take that empowerment for ourselves and take that ownership for ourselves. So I'm going to kind of move towards my last stories and section now. So if you use discovery to be additive to the process, and if you pay into your stakeholder bank balance, make sure that you are seen as an enabler, as somebody who makes things happen, not as a blocker. You might get to a point where things start to move quicker than they have been, where things start to shift more than they have been. And this happened to me in an organisation. So in the organisation with the PMO, actually, large organisation, we'd been speaking for probably about 18 months about how, as a digital team, we really wanted to be involved in setting the strategy for our products. We really wanted to be involved in setting the roadmap for our products. And at the time, we weren't really particularly involved. So one day I was in a meeting and the stakeholder turned around and said, yeah, okay, you take ownership of the product strategy. I nearly fell off my chair because it was not expected. But the problem was we were not ready for it. We were not ready for that sudden shift. And we probably had a window of about a week where we could have come back to that stakeholder and gone, here's a strategy, here's some suggestions, we want to follow it. And we just had not done any of the work to be ready for that. So that was a really big learning for me. I mean, in the end, we managed to kind of negotiate some outcomes, so we did move ourselves a little bit further forward, but we missed quite a big opportunity there. So what I've really learned, and this really applies if you're, no matter where you are in the team, if you're a product manager, you don't have to be a product leader to do this. Don't wait for permission to do some of this work in the background. It might feel that it's going to sit on a shelf, might feel like it might not get used, but what happens is you start to embed that knowledge within yourself, and it makes you more credible when you're speaking to stakeholders because you can actually start to talk about the strategy and what that could look like, and you can start to talk about some opportunities and what they could be. So although it might not be directly used, it helps you talk about it, and it means that you are ready if change suddenly does happen. And I came across this recently, and I really wish I had known about this a few years ago. It's a stupid wild-ass guess strategy. It's from Hustle Badger, who are great, by the way, if you want to look at product management resources. Don't work for them. I should get commission, though. And it just lets you spend an hour to map out your product strategy. So, you're not going to spend lots of effort on this, but just based on your knowledge today, what you know, if you don't know, have a guess. Just what do you think that strategy looks like right now? And then you can start to go to some of your friendly stakeholders. Does this align with your expectations? What do you think? I only spent an hour on it. It's just a bit of rough thinking. And you can take it to your team. What do you think? It's just a bit, give me your ideas. But it's a start, it's a foundation, and it can start to give you more leverage for speaking to stakeholders about it in the future. And by doing this, you're probably going to get to about 80% right versus if you'd spent 2 weeks on it. And if you spent 2 weeks on it, you're probably going to get to about 80% right than if you spent 2 months on it. So you don't have to spend lots of time on this, but it's just starting that thinking. Give yourself permission. The final point that I really wanted to touch upon, and I think this is probably one of the most important points, is to look after yourself in all of this. Because so many of the people that I coach, that I work with, I talk to, they feel like they are a lone voice swimming against the tide. They feel like they're really alone in pushing this change forward. And it can be really exhausting because you put so much of yourself into it. You have to kind of take a lot of the punches and roll with them. It can be quite tough. So really think about how to manage yourself in this situation. Now, a few years ago, I was working with my own coach, and he said to me, you give and you give and you give, and you're on the floor and you're still giving. And that really resonated true with me, because if you've got on the floor, you've got nothing left to give, you're not going to be getting good outcomes. So he worked with me to figure out what are the things that give me energy. How can I make sure that they're non-negotiable within my diary, whether that's things at work that give me energy, whether that's things at home that give me energy. For me, that's exercise, meditation, doing PowerPoint presentations because I'm a bit weird. But what is it that you enjoy doing and that recharges your battery? And what is it that takes away from your energy? And you might not be able to get rid of all those things that take away your energy, but you can at least be aware of them. You can try and make sure that you're balancing out the energy-giving things with the things that are taking away from your energy. So think about how you can manage that in yourself. And this is all part of a reflective process, and I think reflection is a really underutilized tool that is probably one of the most valuable tools that we have. Now, I did this exercise with that principal delivery manager that I worked with, and we did a timeline reflection. So we mapped out all the times, we mapped out all the events that happened, and then we mapped out all of our learnings. And it can be great doing this with somebody else, because actually I learned loads from him in terms of what his perspective was on things, and I'm sure he did from me in terms of my perspective. So take that time to actually reflect on what's happened. I've put on some questions for self-reflection here to get started. So I build reflection now into my routine. So at the end of every day, I just quickly note down 3 small wins and I quickly note down a learning. And then at the end of the week, I kind of go back through those and I think about what are my wins across the week, what are my key learnings across the week. I might answer some of these reflection questions. I kind of rotate them around. I might just do one a week. At the end of the month, I go through that same process, but for the month. Because change, when you're in it, feels like it happens so painfully slow. If there was one common theme in organisations that I hear every time, it's so slow. It's changing really slowly. But when you look back, you go, actually, 6 months ago, it wouldn't have worked like this. 6 months ago, this wouldn't have happened. It wasn't as good as this. So take that time to celebrate those wins and to look back, because we're so very good at looking at what needs to be improved. Remember to reflect on what's gone well as well. Okay, so, if I could speak to youngish Holly when she started out in a product manager career, I think I'd say to her, don't get so hung up on how things should be. Think about how things can be. Think about how we can just make things that little bit better. And don't feel like a failure if it's not looking like it does at the conference. That's okay. You're just working within your constraints. So I've summarised all the points in case you want to take a quick photograph. I think, change just, like I say, happens really slowly when you're in it. So make sure that you're taking that time to reflect. Make sure that you are being a positive entity and that you're thinking about those stakeholder relationships and using the tools that you have and applying them. Okay. So after this talk, I'll be sending around a guide about what I've been speaking about today, how to shift towards a more outcome-led way of working. Feel free to sign up to that, and they'll occasionally send a newsletter. Some book recommendations there. Unfortunately, the contrast on the screen's not great, but Inspired by Marta Kagan and Transformed as well by him, and Continuous Discovery Habits by Teresa Torres are all great books that talk more about this. I find the one by Teresa Torres is quite practical in its application, so definitely a good place to start. And please do feel free to leave me some feedback as well. I'm always looking to improve my talks, so I always appreciate a bit of feedback as well. So thank you very much.
Awesome. Any questions for Holly? Whilst we have anyone from the audience have a question? Oh, yes. There we go.
Point number 3. What I found interesting, you said to maybe mention the discovery process later, because the stakeholders care about outcomes, not about the discovery process. What I found at some points when I was trying to do something similar is they started to ask the questions I already answered, and they had to reprove things where I was, 2-3 steps further. Any thoughts about, how to balance it? Because I've tried not showing them and had the same issues. Anything in between?
That's really interesting. So you've kind of got to that transition phase where they're starting to want that discovery. So that's a good place to be, want them to want that discovery. And yeah, it's thinking about, well, how can we start to, now they're ready for it, how can we just start to bring them into that process a little bit? It can be a little bit tricky, but things like recording a user interviews, depending on how senior they are, depends on how much detail you show, you might just give them little snippets in terms of little sound bites of what you're hearing. So you're kind of starting to just open up that process a little bit if they're reaching that point where that's exactly where you want them to be, that people want. They want you to do discovery because they're seeing the value in it. Yes, brilliant.
Any other questions? Oh, right at the back.
Just giving you a workout.
Thanks, Marcel.
Hey, thanks for the talk, super interesting. A lot of stuff resonates with what I'm currently doing. I just wanted to ask you about, so I have a little bit the problem to balance the need for research versus things that you actually know and maybe don't need to research. So the organization I work with, super seniors, stakeholders, very long-standing organization, and I think they bike shed or procrastinate, so they're like, we need to research. I'm like, you've done this 20 times, you do not need to research this. And then on the other side, there are the researchers, no offense, but they want to research everything. And I'm like, there are certain patterns in, I don't know, onboarding registration, which have been, they're solved. You, again, don't need to research those. And have you come across this kind of problem, and how do you manage that?
Yeah, it's really common. So I think talking about the stakeholder side, understand what's driving that, because there's probably a reason. It might be that they are not feeling comfortable with the direction that things are going, but they don't know how to intervene with that. So if you can dig into them and kind of what's driving that, what's kind of causing them to feel like that, or it might be a case of you need to kind of show them the research that's been done before, but usually there's something underneath that that's kind of driving that. They're not feeling comfortable somewhere. And with the teams, again, it's really common that they kind of get into that analysis paralysis of thinking about, we need to have 100% confidence on everything. You can't. The only time that you have 100% confidence is when you've actually released something and people are buying it in droves and you can't keep up with demand. That's when you've got good confidence with something, and probably not even them, because there's probably still somebody somewhere that it's not quite working for. So things like, I find assumption mapping is quite useful. So that 2x2 grid where you map all the assumptions that you're making and you map them against what's important, what's not important, how much evidence do you have where you've got good evidence, you've got poor evidence, and refocus people on that area where you've got, it was on this side, you've got low evidence and it's really important, and reset that expectation that you don't need to focus on these other areas necessarily. It's kind of constantly saying, we just need, I think Stuart was saying in his talk earlier, you just need 70% confidence. We're not looking at 100% confidence. What's good enough? What's the least amount of research we need to do to move us just onto that next stage where we're going to do some more testing, because we're going to get a bit more confidence at the next stage.
Ideal. Yeah, thank you. Any other questions from our audience? Nope.
Thank you. So in the projects that I work on, I work a lot with sales and marketing and roles that are just outside product and tech, and sometimes they're not close to what product discovery is and the benefits. And when they suggest ideas, what tips do you have in order to make them understand that product discovery is not just a way to, let me just show you that, let me just make sure that what you're saying actually makes sense. And because I've seen that sometimes they don't know what it is and they find it a little bit weird that we are dedicating this time to do that?
Yeah, it really depends on where you are with that relationship with them and their role. So if it's somebody a bit more junior, sometimes you can actually bring them into the squad, bring them in as part of the team and have them work with the team through that process. If they're sometimes a little bit more senior, you might have to use some of those tips around maybe you do some of it in the background and you bring them in at a later stage. So you're still showing your work after you've done it and helping them understand those concepts, making sure that it's additive, making it a positive experience for them. But you're kind of just starting to introduce them to some of the benefits. And again, think about what it is that's important to them and how this is going to be good for them, how this is going to make life easier and better for them and make them better at their role.
Thank you.
Cool, fantastic. That was brilliant. Thank you, Holly.
Thank you
Another
very
round
much.
of applause.